Without further ado, it's with great pleasure I'd like to introduce Liz Thackray from U3A. Originally, this membership in conversation with call was planned to be with Sam, who's Chief Executive of U3A. Unfortunately, she's on compassionate leave. We found out yesterday, and Liz, who is chair of U3A, stepped in. So what could be more perfect than to have the chair here? And delighted that you were able to fill in at such short notice, and because I know there's a lot of people registered for this event, and they were really excited about hearing from you. So Liz, without further ado, I think you've got a really interesting background, your life story, and how you actually ended up, that's a rather crude way of putting it, but how you came to be where you are today and doing what you're doing today. And I wondered if you would mind taking a few minutes to just tell us that background.
Yes, certainly. In fact, in many ways, saying ended up is a very realistic description of what has actually happened. But let's start at the beginning and tell the story. My initial career was in social work and community work back in the 1970s. And through that, I got involved with voluntary organisations, mainly in the disability sector at that stage. Moved into various management roles within the voluntary sector, and then shocked everybody by when I was just over 40, my son was born. And everybody thought I was on a career track, and instead my life suddenly turned around, and turned around even more in that my husband got offered the possibility of working in Germany. And we took the opportunity as a family to move to Germany, where we lived for 4 years. During that time, it became clear that my son was not quite the same as the other children that we were encountering. And on return to the UK, we got bit by bit diagnoses of dyslexia, and there's recognition that my son's on the autistic spectrum, which led me into a lot of wrangles with local authorities and setting up a support group for parents with children with similar disabilities, because I realised that I had skills that other parents didn't have with my background in social and community work. So I was able to argue the toss with local authority officers in a way that others might not have been able to. But it was very clear to me that I couldn't return to my previous professional life simply because I didn't have the time to do that with everything else I was doing. So I took the opportunity to do a conversion master's degree into information systems and management information systems. And on the back of that, got posts in a girls' school where I became the IT manager, and at the same time was appointed by the Open University to be an assistant lecturer on a number of courses, initially in information technology, but later in things like systems thinking, and later still in work around disability and enabling students on research and other aspects of work with children and young people. I got into the research field because I was one of these people who decided that a good form of retirement preparation was to do a PhD. And the interesting thing about that was that I was not the only person who thought that was a good idea. And I still remember going to a training session where there were about 60 students, and we were divided into groups according to how long it was since we'd done our first degree. And there were 5 of us that acknowledged that it was at least 40 years since we'd first graduated. A few years ago, I moved up to North Wales. Took me a while to join the U3A, even though I was aware of it. And when I joined, it was basically to keep my German language skills going. Lockdown came, and we received a letter from the chair of our U3A saying everything is closed. And I just thought, that's ridiculous. I'd done enough online work with the Open University to know that there was good quality video systems available, explored them, found that Zoom was probably the easiest to use in terms of accessing it. Got my own groups in my own locality going again, and contacted the U3A office saying if I can be of help. and found before I knew where I was that I was actually the initiator of Zoom tutorials for anybody who wanted to know how to use the software. A few months later, I got myself co-opted onto a couple of national committees, and one day somebody said to me, have you ever thought of putting yourself forward in the board elections? And I said, don't be so ridiculous. I've only been a U3A member 3 years. You've got to have been on your local committee. You've got to have done things regionally. You've got to have done this, that and the other. And I was told, no, you don't. Anybody can be it, providing you're nominated. And as we talked it through and looked at the different things that I was bringing from my skill set gained over the years in different settings, it stopped being such a ridiculous suggestion and became something that was worth looking at. And a few months later, I found myself elected as chair, which is a position I've been in since August last year. So you're talking at the moment to a full-time volunteer who's also found herself where she didn't expect to be, but is using skills that I've gained through that whole experience of the different things I've done over the last 40 or 50 years. I'm now 71, so I'm very much alive and kicking and doing interesting stuff.
Absolutely fascinating. Thanks, Liz, for sharing all that. And it is amazing, isn't it, how things come round and work full circle, and then the different skills come back into play, and particularly in your career and life story. Really, really interesting. So thanks ever so much for sharing that. And I think the U3A were pretty lucky to have you in North Wales at that point in time to keep things going. So absolutely amazing. But let's move on, and the first question, of course, is what is the U3A? What's your mission, and how does your business model work? What's the history of the organisation? Why was it set up?
Right. Let's start with the history. We're 40 years old today, this year. The first U3A in the UK was launched in February, March 1982. It was brought together by 3 men, all of whom had got a background in higher education, and one of whom had a background in community development. What they recognised at that time, and we've got to remember we're talking about the late 1970s, early 1980s when the idea was born, they recognised that many people were coming into retirement having not had the opportunities in their lives that would have been open if they had been born 20, 30, 40 years later than they were born. And that many of these people had learnt through what one might broadly describe as the university of life, and had a lot of skills, a lot of knowledge to share, but also an appetite to continue learning. So the idea was to set up a learning organisation aimed at people who were no longer in full-time employment. And I think it's important to get hold of that phrase, no longer in full-time employment, because it was not primarily for people who were fully retired, but people who might be partially retired as well. And that might be very relevant, I suspect, to many of the members of this organisation. And that continues to be our, if you like, our age thing. We don't say you must be a given age before you can join the U3A. We say no longer in full-time paid employment. So basically the idea was floated. Initially there were 2 models that were available. One was to attach to a university, which has happened in a number of countries. And the other was to basically set up what we ended up with, which was local independent groups of volunteers meeting together, forming their own circles and developing their own activities within those circles. And unlike many voluntary organisations, we are very much a volunteer-led organisation. We have an extremely small group of paid staff. At the moment, we've got 20 full-time equivalent paid staff running an organisation of 400,000 plus members and over 1,000 local U3As. So it's in an enormous voluntary organisation in the true sense of volunteer organisation. Over the years, clearly we've developed and we've changed, whereas initially there was more of an emphasis on formal learning. The emphasis always has been on mutual aid and a peer-to-peer learning model. Very early on, the founders of the organisation realised that people were not just interested in looking at academic subjects, but they were also interested in a much wider range of activities and learning about things they perhaps had never had the opportunity to learn or had skills to share that they hadn't shared before. So it was just as legitimate to be going to a language course or an archaeology course led by a volunteer tutor from within the organisation generally, as it was to be going to a flower arranging session or learning how to do watercolour painting or going walking and observing the landscape around you. So we don't specialise in being an academic organisation, but we are a learning organisation, and we recognise that everybody has got something that they know that they can share, and we encourage our members, if there isn't a group in an interest group in their particular U3A on what they're interested in, to start it and see what happens.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. So that answers a few of the other questions that I've got. So just in summary, basically it could be anything, could be the topic. It's a learning organisation, and it depends, it's kind of stimulated by what people are interested in, but they could join existing groups that are already there. And in terms of the types of people, so I would need to be not in full-time employment, and then I could look into it. And what would be the kind of business model then? You know, how do you then get involved if you want to become a member?
The easiest way to become a member is just simply to find out if you've got a local U3A. And there are two ways of doing it, or two fairly easy ways of doing that. One is simply to switch on your computer, go to Google or your favourite search engine and enter the name of your town and U3A. And the chances are that you will get some hits that will make sense. Alternatively, if you don't want to do it completely blind, you can contact the national office, and I think perhaps we ought to make the website address available to you, which is simply u3a.org.uk. And there you will find that you can speak to somebody on the phone, or you can look at the website and there's a search engine including a map for U3As. It's worth saying that sometimes there will be more than one U3A within a locality, and by that I'm meaning within 10 or 15 miles travelling distance of where somebody lives. And it's worth looking at what the different U3As offer, because you may find that some are very large organisations. We have got U3As with over 3,000 members. We've also got U3As with 200 or fewer members. Clearly, they're going to be working in different ways simply because of the scale of the organisation. And once you've found your U3A, hopefully it will have a website. It will then have a form that you can complete to ask about membership, or hopefully a phone number that you can contact and say, can I come along and see what you're doing?
Okay, great. And Zoe's kindly put in the chat the web address there, so u3a.org.uk, for anyone who'd like to follow up on that. So how has U3A made a difference to people? Do you have any testimonials, any case studies, any anecdotes that you could share with us?
Yes, I think where it makes a difference is different ways for different people. Perhaps just mention my neighbours when I lived in Sussex. They had moved to the area to be near their family, didn't know anybody in the locality apart from their family, discovered the local U3A and it became very much the centre of their lives, because they were able to join the Francophiles group and made day trips over to France, and actually at the end of the day bought a cottage in France because they were so taken up by what they'd seen over there, but also found the U3A was invaluable when the husband became ill, and it was members of the U3A who were able to advise on what local resources there were, and eventually to help when it came to funeral planning, because they were the people who knew the area. So for many people, the U3A is a good way to get to know the locality if you're moving into a new one, or if you're in the position that many of us are in, where we've lived in a locality for a long time, but we don't really know it because we've been so tied up with work and the social life attached to our work that we don't actually know what's happening where we live. But there's other people who've been able to do things that have made a very big difference to their lives, such as a man up in Yorkshire who has developed walking football and walking cricket. And we've probably seen those advertised on TV if we watch some of the adverts that are there, but had this idea of, well, why shouldn't people who no longer want to run around a football pitch not be able to still engage in their favourite sport? And it's an idea that has spread and has spread throughout the country. Other people will find that they're able to use skills that they've used earlier in their lives, but thought they were not going to get the opportunity to do again. It's, for many people, they describe it as a life changer, because there's a time when they think, well, maybe I'm just going to be at home going on holidays because I've got a decent pension pot, and basically enjoying myself until I'm not able to, suddenly finding there's other people like themselves who are interesting, wanting conversation, wanting social activities. It's not just about learning, but our motto is learn, laugh, live. And it's about that whole connectivity of the whole of our, it's about being a social being rather than stuck wondering what to do with yourself.
So learn, laugh, live. That sounds very appealing. Now we've got a couple of, I've got some more questions, but we have got a couple of questions coming in from Naresh. So I thought I would move over to those to make sure we got them covered. And Naresh is asking, what have you found most surprising about your own learning experience with U3A?
For me, it's been almost the recovering of what I had learnt before and finding that I can still do stuff that I could do 30 years ago but hadn't been doing. What I want to do but haven't got the time to do because of hanging on the chair is to get more involved in the local craft group, because craft is one of my passions, particularly doing things that involve thread. And there's a lot of craft skills which I've never got into because I've tended to do knitting, lace making, that kind of thing. And I'd love to know how to do macrame, because strangely, it's something I've never learned how to do. So yes, it's the things on my agenda, my wish list of, I want to learn how to do this, I want to learn how to do that. The other thing which is mind expanding is looking at the experiences of other people and the lives that they've lived. And one of the things I've been quite amazed by is the number of people I've met who have got families in Japan, of all places, and learning from those new friends that I'm making more about a lifestyle that I know more or less nothing about without hearing it from people who've got those friendships, those contacts.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely fascinating. As you say, sort of mind-opening, broadening, etc. Now, and Naresh also asked about employers, and I guess that applies to those who are in part-time employment still. And he's wondering whether employers have had any involvement in supporting students in their learning.
At the moment, not directly, but we're very open. If somebody wants to say, we think our employer could be useful to you, to hear from them.
Thank you. And Helen's got a great comment here. My 82-year-old mum is a massively active U3A member. Scrabble, table tennis, walks, knitting, German, etc. So excellent.
Yes, it's a real parade of the different things that people get involved in and want to be involved in, and the opportunity to do things you've never thought of before.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you originally when I was planning this, why is there a need for a learning organisation focused on this age group? But I think you've covered a lot of that already, in that kind of planning to carry on, go on some nice holidays, live out your last days, etc. But this actually opens up such a lot more. But is there anything you'd like to add on that point as to the need for this kind of organisation?
I think it's that as we move into retirement, we're losing a lot, and we're losing what we've had in our work experience, not just what we've been doing as a task, but the whole social element. This is part of being somebody at work, and being able to have conversations with other people who understand us, and where we can have, dare I say it, intelligent conversation with others. And I think sometimes there's this huge fear of you're going to become retired, and suddenly you're going to be cast aside, and the only thing for you is going to be some kind of old-fashioned day centre where you go, you sit around the corners of a room and you play bingo. And I suspect that none of your members, and definitely that's not what I want to spend my life doing. So it's something about having somewhere where you can go, where you can be yourself and do interesting things. And for some people, it's about developing new skills. I was at a meeting yesterday where we were talking about research, and we've got within the U3A quite a number of people who come from academic backgrounds. But what they were talking about was how they had been enabling people in their local communities to develop skills that they hadn't previously had in research methods, and to do some constructive research that was now of a publishable quality. And it was not that the people who were the ex-university types that had been doing this, but it was folk that had never thought of doing research in their lives, suddenly discovering they could do. So it's about recognising that we are intelligent, able, valid human beings, whatever our age.
Absolutely. We also talk a lot about resilience, because our treasurers need resilience, as do we all. And we talk about some of the resilience boosters. There's 5 that I often list out in any of the coaching I do, or my podcasts, etc. on the topic. And one of them is learning. People often think, learning, that's an extra task, that's something else I've got to think about or worry about, etc. But all the research shows that learning builds your resilience. So I imagine the U3A is a great resilience builder for people.
I'm sure it is. There's so many different ways in which people are learning. Sometimes it's almost subconscious that you're learning new things, and sometimes you deliberately decide that you want to learn something. My husband belongs to a maths group. Now, maths has been his background all his life, but there are people that come to that group simply because they want to help the grandchildren with their GCSEs, and maths, as your members will know, and I know that you're a numerate group, and probably most of you have studied maths at some point in the past, but maths has changed a heck of a lot over the last 50, 60 years in how people even do simple things like long multiplication and such like.
Yes, I know that from my own experience. When you try and tutor children, then you realise how out of touch you are with what's going on nowadays. Absolutely. So what are some of the challenges for the U3A?
I think the biggest challenge we've got, strangely, is the very fact that we are a learning organisation. And for some people, the very fact, we've changed our name over the last couple of years. We've done a rebranding because we used to be known as the University of the Third Age. And what we found was the word university was a turn-off for many people who would have liked to join our organisation because they thought they were going to find themselves in a very academic, unfriendly community. And we're therefore calling ourselves the U3A. And we're not trying to say U3A stands for, we're saying we're the U3A. You don't ask what BMW stands for. We all know what a BMW is. So one of the challenges is actually saying, yes, we are a learning organisation, because we have got members who are saying, well, isn't that a bit off-putting? And I would say, no, it's not off-putting, providing we frame it correctly. We have got members who say, well, we're more interested in the social side than we are in the learning side. I would say, great, we should be with 400,000 members, we're big enough to have people within our movement that are academic. And we've also for people who haven't the least bit of interest in academia, and why should they have? So we're a bit of a patchwork, but I think one of the things which has been both a challenge and a very positive development push for us has been the last 2 years, and has been the pandemic effect. Because one of the things that happened very early on in the pandemic was not only learning to communicate using Zoom, but also setting up a online version of the U3A, which we at the time called the Trust U3A. And there were many people who joined this online community and engaged in similar groups to what they could have done in a face-to-face group. And what that means is that we now are able to address a challenge that was not so easy in the past, which is when there are very esoteric interests that a local U3A may not have enough members that would to be interested in. We can now offer that kind of group as an online experience, where if people are interested in Egyptian hieroglyphs, let's say, just to pull something out of it, there's the possibility of that group existing and being a viable group as an online group, whether or not there is any face-to-face contact. So we're looking at how we become not just a geographically orientated group, which we always have been, but also how we become an organisation that can encourage communities of interest.
Great. Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. Getting quite excited. It's a shame I'm in full-time employment, but I'm planning which of the groups I might want to join. At the ACT, we talk about the importance of giving back to the wider community, and I'm sure many of those on this call will have been encouraged to join the mentoring scheme as a mentor as well as a mentee, amongst other initiatives, of course. And mentoring is one of the U3A's initiatives as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, Liz?
Yes. As I've said, the U3A is a voluntary organisation. We are volunteer-led. We are dependent on people being prepared to step forward, to lead our interest groups, to sit on our local committees, to sit on our national committees, to get involved in training, etc., etc. Very often people may be interested in doing some of these things, but think, I've never led a group, or I've never sat on a committee, or I've never done whatever it is. And by providing opportunities with supportive others who have been on that same journey, but a few steps further on, we're able to provide that support and that mentoring that enables people to say, hey, I can do that too.
Excellent. So learning on the job, if you like.
Very much learning on the job, and being enabled by other people who are like yourself.
Excellent. Well, I have got another question or two, but just like to encourage our audience. I know we've had a few questions and comments already. If you have questions or comments, do pop them in the chat, or there'll be an opportunity in a short while for people to raise hands and speak if they would prefer to do that. But on to my next question, but do get your questions ready, members of our audience today. So yeah, everything that the E3A does helps change attitudes and perceptions about older members of society from our view, from what we know of it so far at the ACT. So could you talk a little bit about the importance of doing this and how you found attitudes have changed over the past 40 years?
I think it would be true to say, it's interesting because back in the 1980s, I was chief officer of an age concern organisation. And one of my very real memories is the chair who insisted on being called a chairman, even though she was the widow of the man who had formed the organisation 40 years earlier. And she was talking about the work we were doing, and she was about to celebrate her own 80th birthday. And she was talking about these poor old people that we must do something to help. And I was sitting there thinking, I'm not sure about that. But there was that attitude there that many older people were no longer able to do things, were no longer capable of doing things that they had been able to do and were capable of doing in the past. There was a failure to recognise that the fact that you are no longer in full-time employment doesn't mean that you're over the hill and can't do things. Now, I think we're much more recognising the importance of people that are older and that we have not stopped being able to be contributors. It's interesting, if we look at the United States, if we look at the age of the current president, and, you know, I think attitudes have begun to change. But there is still a tendency sometimes, particularly with much older people, to forget that they're still very, very much able to make a contribution. So attitudes have changed, they are changing, but also the role of older people in society is changing. If we go back to the 1980s, it was less common for women to be in full-time employment after they had children. Now it's the norm, or almost the norm, that women will return to employment after a reasonable length of maternity leave. And that has meant a change in the lives of older people, because in the early 1980s, we didn't hear people talking about doing their grandparent duties. Now, we're familiar with the fact that for the modern family, the grandparents are almost an essential part of how that family functions. So we had a whole lot of change in how we see older people. We're seeing more images of older people on our TV screens, particularly when it comes to some of the female actors who are still very much occupying proper acting roles and are not being pushed into the corners that they may have been in the past. So yeah, we've still got a way to go, and there's still a lot of ageism around and feeling that maybe people shouldn't be doing some of the things they are doing. But at the same time, we've got a much more positive view of aging and a recognition, as we saw with Captain Tom, wasn't it, back in, you know, that, you know, even when you're 100, you could still raise, how many millions was it?
Yeah, no, absolutely amazing what he did. So it's interesting. So I've been, you know, knowing this call's coming up, I've been thinking about it and also chatting with Louise, my colleague, about it. And I think you're right that things have changed a lot. And that example you give of female actors, you know, is one that's, you know, very relevant. Just think about Meryl Streep, you know, and Mamma Mia, amazing what she did, and nobody's commenting on her age except when they say it's amazing. But thinking though also, we often are looking at the younger generations coming into the workforce, thinking about how things might change for Treasury in the future. One of the things that is a topic I think there's quite heated debate on, so the neuroscientists neuroscientists even will say that young people's brains are forming differently, and that because of all the technology used, they have a different way of learning, they have a different way of thinking, etc. Though I know other people, not mentioning any names, but some very kind of experienced people in major roles in business and society would say they don't think that's actually happening. So the jury's out on that. But it does make me wonder whether over time there's going to be a bigger divide between the different generations, which could be, well, it could be an advantage in a way that you have then diverse groups. So you want to have some of the older generation and the younger generation in everything that you do, whatever your organization is, because then you've got true diversity. Or could there be a feeling from the younger generations that really the older generations haven't got a place to play anymore because they don't think in the new way? I wonder if you've had any thoughts on that yourself, Liz.
Yes, I think it's an interesting one, and it's one of the things we're looking at as an organisation is how we can become more intergenerational in some of our activities. And one example of that is that COP26 last year, the U3A had a couple of stands in the, I suppose it was the fringe area, I'm not quite sure what they called it, but the activities they put together with much younger people, and really engaged because there was something, there was an interest in common that both could contribute to in different ways, but at the same time there was that shared concern. And I think it may be that younger people are going to be growing up differently, and there's all sorts of reasons why we can look at an intergenerational divide, which are not just connected with how we learn, but are connected with the expectations of younger people. And, you know, if you start looking at it from an economic point of view, I married when I was 27. We bought our first house and moved into it when we got married. That was quite normal in the 1970s and beyond. For a young couple today at the same age, in some occupations, yes, they will have the means to do that. But for most younger people, moving into home ownership is a real almost impossibility unless you've got parents that are able to provide the deposit and to assist, etc., etc. So I think that the divide is not necessarily about how brains are developing, but how society has changed. And I don't want to get into the politics of it, but there are some real challenges, I think, as we look ahead as to the debt burden that that our younger people are facing, compared to the privileges that people who went to university at the time I did have actually had.
Indeed, indeed. So we'll move away from the more political angle there, and I've got a couple more questions in the chat. So one of them is, it seems to be a great way to try new things with people who are experienced. If your local U3A doesn't cover a particular topic, how can you participate in the activities of other U3A groups?
Different U3A, each U3A is an independent organisation, and we can't tell U3A, a U3A, this is how you should behave. Having said that, most U3As either have some kind of agreement with other local U3As whereby they will share some activities, or they have affiliations schemes whereby you can join a second U3A and pay a much lower fee to join that U3A. I belong to two U3As. I belong to my U3A in North Wales. I also belong to Chester, which is just 15 miles down the road from where I live, because they offer different things. So that is one way of doing it, simply by being able to join or to participate as a guest in another U3A. The other thing is that you may find that the thing you're interested in is offered through the online offerings that we're now developing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
But you've got to dig around a bit, you've got to ask questions.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And then the next question is, are there overseas chapters you can join? Oh, there's a thank you for that, the answer to that previous question as well, just come up. But yeah, next question, overseas chapters.
There are overseas organisations, and it's not so much chapters in that we're part of a bigger whole, but we do have relationships with other U3As. I regularly attend a transatlantic forum, which is organised by a group of later life learning organisations in Canada, and brings together people from not just the UK and Canada, but also from the States and other parts of Europe, and occasionally from the Antipodes, all English speaking, but there is that kind of link. There's a European federation that brings together, and I'm going to say later life learning organisations rather than U3As deliberately, because the name varies according to where you are and the nature of the organisation that's formed. So yes, organisations similar to the U3A exist in different places. Some of them will be much more formal learning, running courses type organisations, often with affiliations to universities or other higher education establishments. Others will follow a similar model to the one we've got in the UK.
Thank you. Any further questions, please do raise a hand and we can get you asking your questions direct to Liz, or if you prefer to pop something into the chat, feel free to do that as well. I'll just give you a moment to find your raise hand buttons. It should be at the top of your screen in the bar, a little hand symbol and a smiley face is what I've got, and then you can just raise the hand that way. And if you're on the phone and can't do that, or want to have a question, just shout up and I'll hand over to you, because I'll see you trying to speak, because I think there's only a limited number that are on the phone, so that shouldn't be too difficult, or pop your question into the chat. Right, I have a question in the chat here. Are there any restrictions on how part-time you need to be to join? Oh, e.g. if only non-working 1 day per week.
I'll give you a concrete example. We've recently employed 1 or 2 new staff on part-time contracts. And one of the staff we've employed is a 40-year-old who is working 3 days a week. And he said, does that mean I'm actually eligible to join the U3A? And we said, yes, but if you do, we won't be able to pay you, because we don't, because as a U3A member, you cannot earn money from the trust. But if he'd come to us as somebody working for another organisation saying, I'm working 3 days a week, I'm 40, I'm not going to return to full-time employment, can I join? He would be perfectly entitled to join the U3A.
I think that's very, very simple and clear. Excellent. Any further questions, either in the chat or by raising a hand? Oh, another one in the chat is, how much is the membership fee, please?
Each local U3A sets its own membership fee, and this is something that gets a little bit complicated, because some U3As will charge a fairly minimum membership fee and then charge for additional activities, so that room hire and other things are covered, whereas other U3As have traditionally charged a much larger fee, but have included everything within that fee. There are problems with both in terms of the actual cost. So I can't say a U3A membership is X pounds. What I can say is that on average, it seems to work out between £20 and £30 per annum. The way the Third Age Trust, which is the overall umbrella body for the U3A movement, works, is we charge what is now described as a subscription, but it's actually a capitation fee to each U3A for their membership. For reasons that are beyond my understanding, it was kept fixed at £3.50 for the last 10 years, and we are just this year, having passed it through our AGM 2 years ago, increasing that fee to £44 per member per year. So part of the subscription that people pay to their local U3A is how the U3A trust itself is funded. What I cannot understand is why we have not had a progressive small increase on an annual basis, because what the result of not doing that has been is that members tend to complain about what their membership fee is, or question much more what they're getting for their money than they might have done if we'd used a more rational approach. But I'm sure that your members would have far more to say about that than I do, and I do not claim to be a financial person. So.
Well, thanks, Liz, and thanks for the transparency. And I hope that answered question as well as it could be, and I also see a thank you in the chat for your response on the part-time question. Any more questions either in the chat or by raising hand? Just trying to switch between both panes, so I'll just pause a moment in case there are more questions. Yes, there's also a thank you for the fees info coming through. I'll just wait a moment too, because sometimes it takes time for people to type in something, and I end the conversation and then you see the question coming in afterwards, which is unfortunate. So so just holding on a moment or two, or if anyone would like to raise their hand to have a human word.
Yes, perhaps while we're waiting to see what people may or may not want to contribute, is to say that I know that I'm talking now, even though I can only see a lot of circles on the screen with initials in them, but I'm talking to people who lived professional lives, who are beginning to think about, well, what happens when full-time work comes to an end? And I would really encourage you to look at the U3A as one of the organisations that you might want to be involved in, both for what you can get from that organisation, but also what you can give to it. Because in your professional lives, though the focus may well have been within the financial spheres, you've also developed management skills, you've also developed analytical skills, skills in speaking to people, conveying information to people. You've developed other interests beyond what you've been doing at work. And you're the very kind of people that we want to be encouraging to join our organisation and to keep it young. Because when I was talking about challenges before, one of the challenges we have is because we're 40 years old as an organisation, it's quite possible that people who are approaching that time in life when they're not working full time do not find it as easy to join us as they might have done 20 years ago. And I just want to give the example of my own brother, who's a retired consultant surgeon. And he decided 2 or 3 years ago that he wanted to learn to play bridge. Our father had been a bridge fanatic. And my brother decided, yes, it was time to stop pretending he didn't want to do what his dad did. And he discovered that the local youth 3A offered a bridge group. He turned up at the door and he looked into the room, and his immediate thought was, I don't think I belong there. He felt, as he said to me, very young and very white. He went into the room and he discovered that the elderly ladies, as he saw them in that room, were as sharp as pins and had many, many things to teach him. And it sometimes takes a little bit of courage to cross the threshold and to go into a room which is full of strangers and find that actually they're a very, very friendly bunch and will welcome you with open arms once you lose your own nerves at going into that room.
Thanks, Liz. That's very good advice. We do have one more question before I'll round things up, and that's how many groups do you have across the UK?
We've got, at the present moment, there are 1,040 U3As across the country.
So plenty to choose from then.
Plenty to choose from, and as I say, all are different from each other.
Well, thank you again, Liz. Thanks for giving your time today and including on short notice. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Great pleasure to hear about your background and what you've, what's led you to where you are today. Great information for our members and for those who are either part-time or partly retired or fully retired in the near future, or are planning to be one or the other. Hopefully they will keep U3A in mind as they transition, or it might even incentivize some to think, well, maybe I'll go part-time just so that I can spend some time with U3A, because it sounds so interesting.
It would be great, and your members would be so welcome, because they would form part of the friendship circle that we've got as a national organisation, but they've also got so much they can contribute locally, regionally, nationally, depending on what they want to do.
Indeed, and thanks for everyone who's joined today. We had at its peak we had about 40 of you, and I know others will be listening to the recording. And as I say, we've had about 70 people registering for the event, so lots of interest and lots of great questions from you. So thanks also for those to the audience. I don't know, and if Louise and Zoe, if we have to round up with any plugs for any forthcoming events or anything that you'd like to say in terms of any further business. So could I ask Zoe or Louise just to flag up? I think we've got a Talking Treasury coming up in the not too distant future. Oh, and I can see messages coming through. Thanking you, Liz, very interesting. But Zoe, do we have anything further that we want to share?
We have, I'll post a link to our events page on our website, so you can just keep an eye on what's coming up, because we've lots of conferences and member events, so just keep an eye on that link. And don't forget to check your newsletter.
And also we have our cash management conference coming up. What we've decided to do, it's scheduled for late February. We're going to shift it into late March. So do keep an eye out for that. It's just simply because of regulation and a lot of people working from home. We just like a little bit more space to prepare, but also because it's going to have some quite exciting new content coming into that. So do keep an eye out for that, as well as for the Talking Treasury, where we can talk about the more technical elements of the job, and some conversations that will be coming up later in the year as well on other hopefully interesting topics for you all. So thanks again to you, but a final thanks. Oh, the dog is moving and hitting something behind me. Thanks again to Liz for joining us today. It was really fascinating, learnt a lot, and hope to learn more in due course myself through U3A.
My pleasure.
Thanks again. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your